because this is what freedom of speech is all about. Over the years, there have been many hundreds of speakers presenting many topics, some of them controversial, some of them extremely controversial, some of them to do with health, education, and so on. In fact, the Inverell Forum is said by many to be the leading event in Australia on matters of freedom. Do you know, it seems that any alternative viewpoint on Port Arthur is forbidden in Australia by those that would be our masters. You're simply not supposed to talk about it. You're certainly not supposed to hear what's being said. And that's why we get the dissent, that's why we get the censorship, that's why we get an attack on those who would give another viewpoint. You know, one of the things I've campaigned against personally is fluoridation. And I would far rather have a debate on fluoridation than just speak on fluoridation. I love the opportunity to go up against what is considered to be the best of science, medicine, and dentists and government people in the country, telling us why we should have fluoridation, or rat poison as it's more commonly known in the rural areas, forced down our throats. So the idea of dissent and to hear other people's viewpoint is just wonderful. Today we've got two speakers speaking on the same topic: Port Arthur, deceit, and terrorism. When Wendy Scurr first heard shots at Port Arthur, she ran towards the Broad Arrow Cafe. She heard something whistle past ahead and stopped and ran into another building, the centre, and phoned the police. She had some difficulty getting across the viewpoint to police that there was trouble at Port Arthur on that tragic Sunday. She was the first staff member to enter the Broad Arrow Cafe. And she's received many commendations for what she did on that day. Now, Wendy's been a Tasmanian all her life, visited the mainland a few times, and we're pleased to have her here tonight. For 20 years, she's been a member of St John Ambulance Brigade. Her role was firstly to teach others about first aid, to also look after the many first aid kits that are on the Port Arthur historical site. And if she wasn't teaching, she was working as a tour guide. And that was what she was doing on that Sunday. Wendy's going to share with us a little of the history of Port Arthur and also the location. And she said this is an important point. And then she's going to tell us what she experienced on that Sunday, her own experiences. I asked Wendy if she felt her life had changed since then. She said totally. From a person that was on call for 100 hours a week, she has not worked a single day. She finds that she can't do many very simple tasks. Without Graham, her husband, who's here supporting her today, we don't know what would have happened to Wendy. She's suffering from post-traumatic stress, or shell shock as it used to be called in the war. And she's asked us to bear with her if she hesitates at any time through a presentation, particularly when she's asked questions. And she's happy to answer questions, because sometimes when she concentrates, it gets very difficult. Now, Wendy, in giving her experiences today, is going to give us a graphic account of what happened. And normally when I see such things in the media, you wonder why they do it. What useful purpose is served by such an horrific viewpoint? But Wendy is concerned that the same thing will happen again. She wants to get across to us what did happen and the horror of it. that she experienced and many others experienced on that day. Ladies and gentlemen, to welcome our first speaker for the new millennium at the Inverell Forum 2001, let's give a welcome to Wendy Scurr.
I would like to thank the people of Inverell and the Forum Committee for inviting me here tonight to speak. If it hadn't have been for these people, I guess my story would never have been told. It certainly was never going to happen in Tasmania, so thank you. On behalf of my husband Graham and Andrew, I would like to thank Robert and his committee for inviting us to speak tonight, also to Mr and Mrs Rumming for collecting us from the airport and accommodating us, and it's very good, I might tell you. There is one other person here tonight that Graham and I met on the phone about 4 years ago, Mr David Barton. Thank you, David, for your support. It has been a pleasure to meet you in person. Thank you also to Andrew McGregor for the work that he's put in. I'd read a lot of the documents on many occasions, and I just read over everything. But Andrew, being an ex-policeman, he had a more investigative mind than what I had. Port Arthur is a story of social engineering at its worst. This is the first time I have spoken in detail publicly of my experience at Port Arthur. Out of respect for those killed and their families, I decided my complete experiences should not be told. I am now convinced that our politicians, elected public servants and their offsiders in the bureaucracy have used this against me in their efforts to make sure that due legal process in relation to the Port Arthur massacre never happens. Comments such as, after nearly 5 years it should be forgotten, to me are an insult. You decide for yourself the possibility of me ever forgetting when I have finished speaking tonight. I haven't anything to hide, I don't sleep well at night, but I hope after tonight there are a few more in the same position, and it's not you people. They know who they are. If the cap fits, wear it. There were many heroes at Port Arthur on the 28th of April 1996. I saw the fear, the terror, and against all odds, the staff and visitors who were there give so much of themselves, more than anyone should have to in peacetime in this country. In some cases, these people had found next of kin and partners deceased or injured, but they had no choice but to keep working on. After all this effort, a lot of these people have been thrown on the scrap heap, especially the visitors. Many of them have told me that they have not heard from any Tasmanian Government department or the Port Arthur Historic Site to ask how they are for the past 3 years or longer. Although I have only had regular contact with a few visitors, there is no doubt in my mind these people would be experiencing considerable difficulty. One of these victims lost her only child that day and has had no less than 30 operations in the last 5 years. She was also very severely injured. In fact, when I hear of their problems, I feel guilty that I'm a Tasmanian. If this is the way we treat our tourists, then I wonder why they visit us at all. And if you want to read a little on this particular lady's story, it is in this week's New Idea. And her name is Caroline Lawton. To these people I say, the thinking Australians are not fooled. They simply don't know the half of it. John Howard said it would be too hurtful for the victims and their families to have a coronial inquiry, as did the Tasmanian Attorney-General Ray Groom. We're still waiting for that coronial inquiry. Without finality, how can we be expected to continue our lives? I recently remember the night I saw John Howard demanding the Australian victims in the bridge collapse at the Maccabee Games be properly compensated by the Israelis. Don't get me wrong, I'm not for 1 minute saying they shouldn't have received compensation, but the Port Arthur victims from all over Australia and overseas never received any more than criminal injuries compensation, and I know many who haven't even got that. To my knowledge, no staff or otherwise have received compensation for any damages. The money from the Australian people was given and spent on transport burials as far as I know. I'm just going to give you a little history and just show you on the map exactly where Port Arthur is. Port Arthur was settled in 1830 and it closed in 1877. And it was once Australia's largest industrial town. They made everything there from ships to nails. There was approximately 12,700 convicts went through there over that period, and many boys. There were many young boys transported from England. There is one guy that I used to talk about, and his name was Blunston. He still has or his descendants have a factory in Hobart that makes Blunston boots. Do any of you have any Blunston boots? Well, that young lad, when he came out from England, he was a street urchin. He learnt the trade of boot making at Port Arthur as a boy prisoner. So it wasn't all that bad for them, because a lot of these boys did make something of their lives. I will talk about communication. Communication with the outside world in the 1830s, using a semaphore system, enabled a message to be sent to Hobart Town and a message returned within 15 minutes. If a phone wasn't available on the day of the massacre, I hate to think what would have happened. All other forms of communication with the outside world were hopeless. Two-way radios, mobile phones. They did it better in the convict days. The authorities had been aware of this problem for as long as I can remember. The Port Arthur site is a government business enterprise and is run by the Board of Management. Thousands of visitors arrive annually. About 90% of these visitors come from interstate and overseas. And it was about 90% of the people that were injured and killed, the same thing applied on that day, so 90%. Now we've got a map here, and I'm just going to walk over here and just show you where Port Arthur is, and Andrew will also be using this map. We have, can everybody see before I start? This is Port Arthur, and this is where Seascape was. This is where Turana was. We're talking about this quite a bit. And this is Eaglehawk Neck, and this is the only way you can get onto the Tasman Peninsula. So you can see why they chose this area as a penal or a prison, because it was surrounded by water, and it would be an island only for this little neck of land, which is only probably 200 metres wide. They had a team of dogs on there, and they were chained together very close, and they used to tell the convicts that this place was infested by sharks just in here, so they wouldn't swim across. But that didn't stop the bush ranger Martin Cash. He had a go. And then we've got this this other peninsula, and this is the Forestier Peninsula. And up here we have a bridge that just, when it's open, completely shuts that off too. So you've got actually the Forestier and the Tasman Peninsula. I won't go any further with any of the others because that's Andrew's talk, but I would also like to point out the coal mines. And I would like you to see where they are in relation to Hobart. Now on Mount Wellington in Hobart, there is a tower that actually transmits all the communications. And the coal mines out here would have been the only place where the perpetrators of this massacre would have planned to leave a heroin haul, as they called it. But I'll talk more about that in a minute. So the Tasman Peninsula's southeast of Hobart. Travelling time from Hobart is 1.5 hours. That's travelling at the speed limit. The road is not very good. It's rather windy and quite narrow.